clashes and arrests as South Koreans voice their anger over the deployment of a US missile defense system. The largest American military base in Afghanistan is hit by a suicide bomber. The Taliban says it was in retaliation for an offensive leaflet distributed by the US Army. Also, Germany's Chancellor Merkel is booed at a campaign rally ahead of the country's federal election. It comes just a day after she was pelted with tomatoes at another event. And a Russian Bitcoin trader wanted by the US in a money laundering case speaks to RT from a Greek prison. Live from Moscow, this is RT International with me, Rosanna Lockwood. Thank you for joining us. Peace activists in South Korea are calling on their government to block the deployment of a US anti-missile system, saying it will escalate the ongoing crisis with North Korea. Clashes broke out and several arrests were made as hundreds gathered at the missile defense site.
Reported that there were around 400 demonstrators there who were protesting the deployment of 4 additional rocket launchers of the U.S. missile defense system, and they clashed with the police. Now, the protesters reportedly tried to break into the administrative building of the U.S. base, but were unsuccessful. Local media has reported that dozens of residents and several police officers, in fact, have been injured in those clashes, and they have been taken to a nearby hospital. A number of arrests have also been made at the demonstrations. Around 8,000 policemen were sent to the area in the south of the country near the future site of the rocket launchers, some 300 kilometers southeast of the capital. Now, America's deployment of hardware includes aircraft carrier strike groups, anti-missile ships, as well as fighter jets and helicopters. Now, the protests follow an announcement by the South Korean Defense Ministry to add the rocket launchers designed to protect South Korea from the threat of North Korea. But South Korean citizens have long objected to their installment, not wanting America to increase their military presence in the country, fearing the move could move to only further escalate the crisis and likely make them a primary target should Pyongyang decide to attack. And they are, of course, not alone in their disapproval of THAAD's deployment in South Korea. Both China and Russia have strenuously opposed the installment, viewing the move as undermining their security interests. Now, this past Sunday, North Korea tested an underground hydrogen bomb, prompting the speed up of the THAAD program, which the U.S. will consider a win as they've long wanted more control in South Korea. But the move itself is clearly leaving few others happy.
The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, known as THAAD, is designed to destroy incoming ballistic missiles. It consists of a launcher, a command and control center, and a radar. Anti-war activist Medea Benjamin recently visited the site in South Korea and told us why the deployment is causing just so much local anger.
Well, no, and one has to wonder why hundreds and hundreds of people would come out to protest a system that is supposedly going to make them safer. I was in that village just a few weeks ago, and it's a very conservative village, and these protests are being led mostly by the elders of the village who say, we don't want to be in the eye of the storm. We know that President Trump has just said he's going to allow more highly sophisticated weaponry to go to South Korea, taking billions of dollars of people's money there. This is a cycle of militarism that is extremely dangerous and the opposite of what people on the peninsula need and want.
Russia and China offered a joint solution to the standoff over North Korea at a UN Security Council meeting on Monday. The two powers called for a double freeze initiative. Under that plan, North Korea would stop its nuclear and ballistic missile tests, and in return, the US and South Korea would halt their joint military exercises. However, the US dismissed the proposal from Moscow and Beijing as insulting. Meanwhile, the Russian president has warned that further sanctions and pressure against North Korea could prove counterproductive. Vladimir Putin made those comments after meeting with the South Korean leader at the Eastern Economic Forum in the Russian city of Vladivostok. Daniel Hawkins is there for RT.
This forum is primarily a place for business and trade interests to find common ground. But one thing really hanging over the forum, one key thing on the agenda, and that's been the Korean crisis, the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. And President Putin and Moon Jae-in of South Korea have now concluded their talks. They've done a joint press conference where Putin, again, as Russia's position has been over the last weeks and months, that diplomacy and negotiation was the only way long-term to solve this crisis. Take a listen.
It's obvious that the Korean Peninsula problem can't just be solved using sanctions and pressure. It's impossible. Let's not be driven by emotion and push North Korea into a corner.
Now, it's evident that there are some differences between the South Korean and the Russian position here. The South Korean government, of course, do favor a strengthening of UN sanctions against North Korea, particularly targeting their oil sector, something that will very much be seen as an escalation in this crisis. The Russians, of course, have favored diplomacy and negotiation long term, and that still seems to be the case. Aside from that, it's very much business as usual here at the forum. Quite literally, there's delegations here from over 50 countries, several thousand people in attendance here, hoping to sign trade and business deals. Last year, that equaled about $32 billion, so very much significant in the Asia-Pacific region.
The North Korea crisis dominated the BRICS summit in Southeast China earlier this week, and there were plenty of other issues on the table, as we heard from the Russian Minister for Economic Development.
Security was one of the key issues at the meeting. Clearly, this summit has been overshadowed by North Korea. The issue came up repeatedly, but there were also talks on cyber and energy security, so it's a very broad agenda. BRICS continues to develop and expand, and everyone at today's event found the discussions between these emerging economies to be positive and useful.
To Afghanistan now, where a Taliban suicide bomber has blown himself up outside the Bagram Air Base, America's largest military facility in the country. No soldiers were killed in the blast. Samira Khan has the story.
Well, a suicide bomber has detonated explosives at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. The attack is believed to be a response to a highly offensive leaflet distributed by U.S. forces in the Parwan province on Tuesday that depicted part of the Taliban flag along with a passage from the Quran on a dog. This is an animal that's considered unclean in Islam. The bombing occurred only hours after a senior U.S. commander in Afghanistan apologized for the leaflets. The Taliban responded, saying it showed America's hatred for Islam and that it proves the war in the country is a war between Islam and unbelief, according to news reports. But this isn't the first time controversy struck the area. In February 2012, U.S. soldiers mistakenly burned Qurans at the same Bagram base, alongside damaged books and texts from the airfield's library. Well, the incident prompted widespread protests and resulted in several deaths. But we have to think that while fundamentalism is mostly to blame for this incident, it seems like U.S. imperialism plays a strong role in providing these terrorists with a motive to perpetrate these attacks. One can only wonder if Trump's new policy on Afghanistan will further exacerbate the situation.
Author and anti-war activist David Swanson told us there is a complete lack of communication between American troops in Afghanistan and locals.
I doubt very much that most members of the occupation from the United States and its allies really care. That's not what they've been trained to do, not what they've been educated to do. They've been put into a situation where they see Afghan people as threatening their lives, and they haven't been educated to think there's anything to learn from Afghan culture. So they are there to, do their job, stay alive, and get the heck out, and let somebody else come in and continue it for generations. But clearly they have no comprehension and no interest in getting any comprehension of the country they're occupying.
Syria Syrian government forces, backed by Russia, have recaptured a large fortified area held by Islamic State in the city of Deir ez-Zor. After retaking the position, Syrian troops found a network of tunnels containing weapons, medical supplies and food. It's also emerged that the area was mainly defended by terrorists from Central Asian nations and Russia. On Tuesday, a Russian warship targeted the militants there, helping the Syrian army storm the fortress. The latest operation is all part of a larger campaign to force ISIL fighters completely out of Deir ez-Zor, which has been under siege for 3 years. During that period, it's become one of the largest pockets of extremist resistance in Syria. Here you can see two government army brigades reuniting after the siege of the city was lifted. One of them had been trapped inside for all of that time. A Syrian journalist inside the war zone described to us what civilians have been going through.
ISIL terrorists prevented food deliveries from reaching the besieged areas of Deir ez-Zor. 1 month after the siege began, all food supplies disappeared from the market. At the end of the second month, the terrorists also cut off the electricity. They seized control of the water pumping plants. In 2015 and 2016, there was a mass exodus of civilians who were fleeing the famine. This year, ISIL militants killed many civilians by shelling residential areas. It was a relentless artillery bombardment. Many more people were maimed.
RT's Ilya Petrenko has more on the operation to liberate Deir ez-Zor.
The people of Deir ez-Zor won't have to pray for these to appear in the skies anymore. For 3 years, airdrops were their only lifeline, and they prayed for what was really just a handful of Syrian soldiers to never let the city fall completely to Islamic State. While ISIL used any means, absolutely anything, to take Deir ez-Zor. It's all over now, but merely 9 months ago, a sea of ISIL around the city and beyond. Half the country in black, as you can see on this map. Since that point, it's only been shrinking. 2017, so far, a nightmare for Islamic State in Syria. I'll break down the milestones for you. Number 1, Palmyra. The city, with more than 3,000 years of history, had really been caught in a tug of war before March, when the Syrian army, with Russian air support, took full control. Number 2, the city of Raqqa, the one known as the capital of the self-proclaimed caliphate. No more capital in Raqqa. Looks like the terrorist commanders ran from there. And thanks to the efforts of the Kurdish units and other US-led coalition fighters, jihadists in the city are fully surrounded. Number 3, breaking the siege of Deir ez-Zor. This was ISIL's one last chance. All the remaining war might they had to offer, off it went to Deir ez-Zor, according to Russian army intelligence. Crushing Islamic State in this area is the next step. Time to check up on the map. Now that's progress. 3 black traces left. The ruins of the self-proclaimed caliphate.
International affairs commentator Jonathan Steele says ISIL still poses a very real threat as foreign fighters try to return to their home nations.
The war is a long way from being over. I mean, the ISIS fighters, particularly the ones who are foreign, will gradually, if they've not been captured, filter back to their home countries, and of course they may start doing terrorist activities in places like Britain, where we've had 3 this summer, or in Barcelona, or in Berlin, or in France. The threat is still very much alive as the ISIS is losing territory in Syria. It's not losing all its manpower.
A report from the UN accuses the Syrian government of using chemical weapons against civilians. It also blames the armed forces for a sarin gas attack back in April in Idlib province. Paula Sleer has more on the report.
The United Nations Syria Commission has issued a report in which it found that there was a chemical attack that was carried out back in April in Idlib, and that those responsible were government forces using sarin gas against the civilian population. They based their conclusions first and foremost on interviews with eyewitnesses, victims, and medical workers. They also used videos and photographs. But what is important is that the investigators themselves did not travel to the scene of this attack, and neither did the investigators of a previous report that was conducted by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. And the findings of the OPCW report were also used by the UN commissioners this time around. But what is also important here is that the OPCW report did not assign blame. It really was investigating whether or not this attack took place. So what this means is that the question of who is to blame, who is responsible, is still open. Now, the United Nations report did not only focus on this alleged chemical strike, it also looked at the question of civilian casualties due to the coalition airstrikes in Syria. And what is not clear is why they mixed these two topics together, particularly because the coalition civilian deaths constitute an important part of the report, and they are based on solid evidence, not least because that evidence is coming from the coalition forces themselves. They have a detailed look at several cases that are confirmed by the coalition forces, and you have the coalition admitting to killing more than 600 civilians, although activists say that that number goes into the thousands. Now, a huge chunk of this UN report is devoted to this question of civilian deaths caused by the coalition forces, and only right at the end of the report is there mention about this chemical attack. And yet, despite this, on Twitter, the United Nations has called this a report into the use of chemical weapons in Khan Shaykhun, and not a report into civilian casualties that were caused by the coalition forces in Syria.
Well, this report deals with a number of issues, and arguably the majority of the report, the main emphasis of the report, is on the what it suggests are unnecessary or excessive civilian casualties caused by primarily US airstrikes around Raqqa, for example, and even in Idlib province earlier this year. It talks about a specific strike on a mosque which it found, which it says actually happened and caused unnecessary civilian casualties. Almost as an extra item, it talks about the Khan Shaykhun attack. It mentions that, or it blames the Syrian Air Force for that. But when we look at media coverage of this in the West, it's almost certainly will fit into what we've seen as a consistent pattern over the entire span of the Syria war and indeed other conflicts.
Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel is travelling around the country to drum up support ahead of the federal election. And in spite of her general popularity, she has received quite the hostile response in some areas. RT's Europe correspondent Peter Oliver has the latest.
It hasn't been the most, well, exciting of campaigns, to put it mildly. The election's on September the 24th, and you would hardly think that we were just a few weeks away when you speak to people on the streets here. However, Angela Merkel's campaign visits to areas with strong right-wing support have certainly provided some moments of, well, that excitement we've been lacking. Here she is in Brandenburg. and whistles for the German Chancellor there. She had said that she would specifically be going to areas that had strong support for parties like Alternative for Germany, the anti-immigration party that's set themselves up as particularly being an anti-Angela Merkel party. She said she's going to go out and see these people, and she has done, and, well, has received a torrent of abuse when she's gone there. She didn't, however, on Wednesday night receive the same type of, harassment as she saw on Tuesday in Heidelberg when, alongside the whistles and boos, 2 tomatoes were thrown at Angela Merkel as she took the stage there. Thankfully, a bright red blazer worn by the German Chancellor to hide any stains. It apparently hit her hip as she was making her way to the stage. Unfortunately, one of the moderators, well, she was hit and splattered with the fruit, Angela Merkel offering her a handkerchief. And interestingly enough, during the rally, she was asked a question, what do you think's your biggest strength? And she said, without making reference to the tomatoes, that she was calm under pressure. But we had hopes, we did have hopes that this was going to be a hard-fought campaign between Angela Merkel and former European Parliament President Martin Schulz of the Social Democratic Party, but it hasn't panned out that way. As it stands at the moment, Angela Merkel around 15% ahead, depending on who you speak to, with only just weeks to go, and it not looking like the Social Democrats are going to catch her up anytime soon.
A member of the Alternative for Germany party told us Angela Merkel has no vision for solving the key problems facing the country.
In reality, she is not leading. She is waiting until a certain line comes up, and then she is following that line. We have the United Nations migration settlement program, which is, I believe, 20 years old. And she is following that line. She's following an international agenda which is not made up for and by the German people. And we are not a rich country anymore. This is becoming a failed state. We are going into becoming a third world country.
The US government is pushing for the extradition of a Russian national accused of cybercrime and money laundering. Alexander Vinnik was arrested in Greece on the 25th of July at the request of the US Justice Department. He is accused of using the Bitcoin trading website BTCE to launder more than $4 billion. The Greek authorities are currently considering the extradition request. Mr. Vinnik spoke by phone from prison in his first interview since his arrest.
I would say they are mistaken. I don't have any planes, yachts, or any other luxury possessions. First, because I haven't done anything illegal. Second, I don't understand what the US has to do with me, and why they should be judging a Russian citizen.
The Russian Foreign Ministry has said it is closely monitoring the situation, and the priority is to ensure that the suspect's rights are respected. Mr. Vinnik's wife, Alexandra, also spoke to RT, giving further details about her husband's detention.
I turned around and saw that my husband was surrounded by around 20 men. 20 men wearing t-shirts and sunglasses took part in his arrest. He was handcuffed. Our children were there at the time. These men walked him away. They also took mobile phones and the key to our hotel room from my bag. As far as I know, they searched the room. Me and my children were kept on the beach from 11 in the morning until 7 p.m. under the supervision of 3 men. We couldn't leave. The children didn't get anything to eat at all. As far as I know from the documents sent from the US, the BTC's activities were against the law there. The document says the managers knew they were creating a platform for money laundering because it wasn't registered, it didn't have a license, and because such business models allow criminals to use the exchange. All the charges are being made based on this statement. By this way of thinking, you could make the manufacturers of frying pans, for example, guilty because wives hid their husbands with them. It's the same thing. Obviously, his return to Russia is my main goal. My husband agrees to be extradited only to Russia and no other country. He wants to come home to his family, to his children.
2 men have been arrested in a suburb of Paris on suspicion of plotting a terror attack. The news comes just hours after it's revealed that Spanish and Moroccan authorities detained 6 people with alleged ISIL links. Charlotte Dubinsky has been following the events. Two men have been arrested and will be charged with terrorism offences. The men were arrested in an apartment in the south suburb of Paris called Villejuif. Now, what we understand is that a maintenance worker or a plumber had been in the apartment fixing a problem there and had alerted the authorities to suspicious materials in that apartment. Now, when the police raided that apartment, they found materials that could be used to make explosives and bombs, such as gas canisters and wires. Now, the situation becomes even trickier when we understand that one of the men arrested apparently has admitted during his questioning in custody that he had been selling bulletproof vests to another man who is a suspect in a murder case here in France, and he's also under suspicion